There is a story Americans like to tell themselves about their military, that it exists to keep them safe, that its enormous cost is the price of freedom, and that the people who build its weapons are patriots first and businessmen second. The Trillion-Dollar War Machine by William D. Hartung and Ben Freeman is a careful, well-documented argument that this story is mostly false. The book traces how the United States built the largest arms enterprise in human history, how that enterprise captured not just the Pentagon, but the universities, the think tanks, the press, Hollywood, and the gaming industry, and how it now consumes nearly $1 trillion a year while delivering less actual security than it did during the Cold War. What follows is a summary of that book, its argument, its evidence, and its conclusions, told in order, in the narrator's own words. Hartung has spent decades studying the arms industry, and Freeman has worked inside the watchdog world that tracks it. Together, they have written not an abstract complaint about militarism, but a concrete map of how money becomes influence, and influence becomes policy. The book's central claim is simple and unsettling. The war machine wins not because it makes Americans safer, but because it has made itself impossible to question. The authors begin with the present, and the present is Gaza, Ukraine, and a defense budget climbing toward $1 trillion under presidents of both parties. Their point throughout is that the pattern does not change with the party in power. The machine endures. It is to that machine, and the question of why it always wins, that we now turn. Introduction: The United States of Armament. The book opens with a striking irony. In the fall of 2024, candidate Donald Trump stood at a rally and denounced the warmongers and the war profiteers, promising to clean up the military-industrial complex. Within months of taking office, he pledged to raise the Pentagon budget to a full $1 trillion. The authors use this whiplash to establish their thesis. The rhetoric of peace and the reality of armament run on separate tracks, and the second always wins. Since Eisenhower coined the phrase military-industrial complex in 1961, no president of either party has consistently chosen diplomacy over war or redirected the government's energy from foreign conflict toward the needs of ordinary Americans. What makes the situation worse than Eisenhower feared is scale and reach. The general worried about the partnership between the uniformed military and the arms industry. Today's war machine is larger and more deeply woven into civilian life. It shapes think tanks, universities, sports, movies, video games, and the news. And here the authors plant the paradox that runs through the whole book. Spending rises while capability falls. Adjusted for inflation, the United States now spends $100 billion more than it did at the height of the Cold War, yet fields roughly half the active duty troops, half the Navy's ships, and half the Air Force's planes. The machine is enormous, expensive, and, in their word, broken. Chapter 1. We Don't Apologize. How the United States became the top arms dealer in the world. The authors begin their case with American weapons in foreign hands, and they begin with Gaza. The scale of death there, they argue, could not have occurred without arms supplied and paid for by the United States. From this painful starting point, they widen the lens. America is the largest arms dealer on Earth, and its weapons flow not only to allies, but to repressive regimes, fueling conflicts and undermining the very diplomacy the country claims to champion. The title phrase captures a posture of refusing to reckon with the consequences. The chapter establishes a moral foundation for everything that follows. That the war machine's products are not abstractions, but instruments with real victims, and that the business of selling them has been normalized to the point of invisibility. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that arming the world is not a side effect of American foreign policy, but a central feature of it, with its own momentum and its own constituencies who profit no matter the outcome on the ground. Chapter 2. From Arsenal of Democracy to Factory of Endless War. To understand the present, the authors return to the origin. 3 days before leaving office in January 1961, Eisenhower warned Americans that a permanent arms establishment, a leftover from the vast mobilization of World War II, had begun to distort the nation's budget and threaten its democracy. He had felt the pressure himself, pushed to fund weapons like a costly nuclear bomber he did not believe the country needed. His phrase for the danger, the military-industrial complex, named a new and permanent fusion of the uniformed military and the arms industry, working together to expand their own wealth and power at the public's expense. The chapter shows how the wartime arsenal of democracy never demobilized. Instead, it became a standing structure, one that needed enemies and missions to justify its continued growth. What began as a temporary response to genuine threat hardened into a permanent institution with permanent appetites. The authors are careful historians here, and the lesson is one a careful reader will recognize. Institutions, once built, develop their own purposes and resist being dismantled, regardless of whether the original need still exists. Chapter 3. Profiteers of Armageddon. Here the authors turn to the most dangerous corner of the arsenal: nuclear weapons, and specifically the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles that sit in silos across the American heartland. Drawing on former defense officials and members of Congress, they argue that these missiles are not only unnecessary, but actively dangerous. Because a president would have only minutes to decide whether to launch them upon warning of an attack, they raise the risk of an accidental nuclear war triggered by a false alarm. Many experts, the authors note, conclude the country would be safer with only two legs of its nuclear triad: bombers and hard-to-detect submarines, which together are more than enough to deter any attacker. So why keep the missiles? The answer the chapter offers is the answer the whole book offers: because they are profitable. A massive program to build a new generation of these missiles enriches contractors, regardless of whether it makes anyone safer. The chapter is a clear, sobering illustration of the book's core mechanism: that weapons get built not because strategy demands them, but because the system that profits from them demands their construction. Chapter 4. The Merchants of Death. Corporations cash in on conflict. The authors open with a scene from a Sunday talk show shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, in which the CEO of Lockheed Martin was greeted with softball questions and treated, in effect, to a free infomercial. From there, they document how the largest weapons firms profit directly from war and instability. The Big Five, Lockheed Martin, RTX, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, divided more than $2 trillion in Pentagon contracts in the 2 decades after the September 11th attacks. Their executives earn tens of millions a year, while the wars that drive their profits cost American taxpayers trillions and leave hundreds of thousands of veterans wounded in body and mind. The phrase "merchants of death" is old, but the authors revive it deliberately to puncture the patriotic gloss. These are publicly traded companies with a duty to their shareholders, and conflict is good for the stock price. The chapter's force comes from its refusal to pretend otherwise. It asks the reader to hold two facts together: that real human beings die in these wars, and that a small number of corporations grow steadily richer because they do. Chapter 5. Endless wars abroad, endless costs at home. Having shown who profits, the authors now count the cost, and they begin with the people the system claims to honor. They draw on the testimony of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, many of whom feel betrayed, unsure why they were sent, doubtful their missions were achievable, and haunted by what they did. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they note, cost some $8 trillion all told. Yet military families sometimes rely on food banks, and the services meant to care for returning veterans are frequently inadequate even as the budget that funds them swells. The chapter's quiet power lies in the gap it exposes between the rhetoric of supporting the troops and the reality of how they are treated. The same system that spends lavishly on weapons spends grudgingly on the human beings who carry them. For a reader attentive to where a society's true commitments lie, the contrast is damning. A nation is revealed not by what it says it values, but by what it actually funds. And here the funding flows to hardware and contractors far more readily than to the wounded and the grieving. Chapter 6. Overseas bases and the cost of military overreach. The authors then map the physical footprint of American power. Roughly 750 military bases in 80 countries. More than 170,000 troops stationed abroad on a routine basis, and a network that costs some $55 billion a year to maintain. This cover-the-globe strategy, the ambition to fight anywhere, anytime on short notice, is, they argue, the single greatest driver of astronomical Pentagon budgets. The bases have been the backbone of one intervention after another, from Iraq to Somalia and beyond. The argument here aligns with a long tradition skeptical of empire and military adventurism. A republic that garrisons the world, the authors suggest, is no longer simply defending itself. It is policing a globe it cannot actually control, at a cost that drains resources from home and entangles the country in conflicts that serve no clear national interest. The chapter's takeaway is that genuine security and global military dominance are not the same thing, and that the pursuit of the second may actively undermine the first. Chapter 7. How the War Machine's Lobbyists Win in Washington. With the costs established, the authors turn to the machinery of influence, the part of the book that gives it its real explanatory force. They open with the literal combat ship, a vessel so flawed the Navy's own testers concluded it would not survive combat, mocked by sailors as the little crappy ship. Why was it built, and why so many? Because lobbyists, not strategists, kept it alive. In 2024 alone, Pentagon contractors spent over $148 million on lobbying and fielded some 950 lobbyists, nearly 2 for every member of Congress. The chapter describes a self-perpetuating loop. Contractors receive hundreds of billions in taxpayer money, spend a portion of it on lobbying to secure even more the following year, and repeat the cycle for decades. The authors capture the human logic with precision. For a well-connected individual, it is an individually rational choice to join a collectively irrational system that wastes money and makes the country less safe. This is the heart of the book's diagnosis. The system is not a conspiracy. It is an equilibrium, in which everyone follows their own incentives, and the result is a machine no one quite controls and no one can easily stop. Chapter 8. An Artificial Consensus, Think Tanks on the Take. If lobbying bends the law, the authors argue, funded expertise bends the conversation that precedes it. They open with the American-made Abrams tanks sent to Ukraine, eagerly touted by their makers and then pulled from the front within months because Russian drones were destroying them. The episode illustrates how weapons get praised by interested parties long before their real performance is known. The chapter then documents how arms industry money flows into the think tanks that shape foreign policy debate, producing an artificial consensus in favor of more spending and more intervention. When the experts quoted in the press and consulted by Congress are funded by the firms that profit from their recommendations, the debate is rigged before it begins. The authors are not claiming every analyst is bought. They are showing how funding quietly tilts the whole field so that hawkish conclusions come to seem like simple common sense. For anyone who cares about truth as something independent of power and money, the chapter is a study in how a marketplace of ideas can be corrupted not by censorship, but by sponsorship. Chapter 9. The Militarization of American Science, Buying the Ivory Tower. The authors carry the same logic into the university. They open with helicopters landing beside the Student Union for Lockheed Martin Day at the University of Connecticut, one of at least a dozen campuses with their own days devoted to the arms maker, complete with internships, scholarships, and loan repayment programs aimed at science and engineering students. The chapter documents how deeply the arms industry has embedded itself in higher education and research, shaping what gets studied, who gets funded, and which young minds get recruited into the machine. The university is supposed to be a place set apart, devoted to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. The chapter shows how that ideal erodes when military money becomes a dominant patron. Research agendas bend toward what the Pentagon and its contractors will pay for, and the institution that should stand at a critical distance from power instead becomes one of its suppliers. The cost is not only financial, but intellectual and moral, a narrowing of what the life of the mind is allowed to be for. Chapter 10. Capturing the Media, How Propaganda Powers the War Machine. The authors turn next to the press, and their central example is the run-up to the Iraq War. In 2002 and 2003, they argue, the mainstream media largely failed to challenge the Bush administration's case for invasion, repeating claims about Iraqi weapons that were later debunked, but only after the war had begun. Hardened journalists adopted the frightened worldview the administration was selling, helping persuade millions of Americans to support a catastrophic war. The chapter shows that media capture rarely looks like crude propaganda. It looks like deference, access, and the quiet absorption of official assumptions. When the press treats the government's framing as the natural starting point, rather than the thing to be questioned, it becomes an instrument of the war machine even when individual reporters believe they are simply doing their jobs. The lesson reaches beyond any single war. A free press is only as valuable as its willingness to doubt the powerful, and that willingness is precisely what the machine works to erode. Chapter 11. The Battle for Hearts and Minds, Hollywood and the Whitewashing of War. From news, the authors move to entertainment and to the long, cozy relationship between the Pentagon and Hollywood. The military offers filmmakers access to ships, jets, and bases in exchange for the right to review and shape scripts, ensuring that the on-screen portrait of American power is flattering. The result is a steady stream of films that glamorize war and sanitize its costs, training audiences to associate the military with heroism and spectacle rather than with the human wreckage documented earlier in the book. This is influence operating at the level of feeling rather than argument. A nation's imagination is formed by its stories, and when those stories are quietly vetted by the institution they depict, the public is shaped to love the machine without ever deciding to. The chapter invites the reader to notice how much of what feels like simple patriotic entertainment is in fact a carefully maintained image, and to ask who benefits from a citizenry that thrills to war on screen while remaining blind to its reality. Chapter 12. Making the military more Disney-like. The Pentagon and the gaming industry. The authors extend the analysis to video games, where the courtship of the young is most direct. They open with the unsettling figure of Palmer Luckey, a Silicon Valley weapons entrepreneur who mused about a virtual reality game so real that dying in it would kill you in life, and who built an exploding helmet to prove the point. The chapter documents the Pentagon's investment in gaming as a recruitment and propaganda tool, a way to make the military feel exciting, immersive, and fun to a generation raised on screens. The phrase Disney-like captures the ambition to wrap the business of war in the friendly, frictionless polish of entertainment. The authors see something genuinely troubling in this, and a reader attentive to the formation of the young should share their concern. When the machinery of killing is presented to children and teenagers as a game, the moral seriousness of war dissolves into entertainment, and a generation is conditioned to see violence as play long before it can weigh what violence actually means. Chapter 13. Brave New War Machine, Big Tech and the Future of the Arms Industry. Looking ahead, the authors examine the new entrants reshaping the industry. Silicon Valley firms like Anduril, Palantir, and Elon Musk's SpaceX, which have formed a consortium to challenge the legacy contractors and capture a share of the Pentagon budget. These upstarts promise cheaper, smarter, more autonomous weapons. But the authors warn that the same technology can dramatically increase the risk of catastrophic error and the automated killing of civilians, as artificial intelligence directing drones in Gaza has already shown. The new militarists are more hawkish on China, more hostile to government, and gripped by a techno-optimism the authors consider genuinely dangerous. Perhaps most striking is the level of corporate capture they document. Tech leaders vetting government appointments, gaining access to sensitive data, and shaping policy from inside the administration. The chapter's warning is that the future war machine may be even harder to restrain than the present one, because it fuses the profit motive of the old contractors with a near-religious faith in technology and a contempt for the limits that wisdom would counsel. The belief that there are few limits to what technology can accomplish is, the authors suggest, exactly the belief most likely to lead to disaster. Chapter 14. From War Machine to Peace Machine. The book's final chapter turns from diagnosis to hope. The authors argue that the vast resources, talent, and industrial capacity now devoted to war could be redirected toward human needs. That the war machine could become a peace machine. They point to historical precedents of arms control and disarmament movements, to the possibility of economic conversion from military to civilian production, and to the reality that the machine's power, however entrenched, is ultimately sustained by political choices that can be changed. The chapter is a deliberate refusal of despair. Having spent the book documenting how deeply militarism has penetrated American life, The authors insist that none of it is inevitable. What human beings have built, human beings can rebuild for better ends. There is something fitting in ending here, because the deepest objection to the war machine is not merely that it is wasteful or dangerous, but that it represents a profound misdirection of human gifts, the genius of scientists, the labor of workers, the hopes of children, as Eisenhower put it, away from the things that actually make for peace. Epilogue: The War Machine in the Era of Musk and Trump. The authors close by, bringing the story fully up to date, examining how the second Trump administration, shaped by Silicon Valley money and figures like Musk and Vance, is poised to expand the machine even further while dressing the expansion in the language of reform. The epilogue underscores the book's central irony one last time. The politician who campaigned hardest against the war profiteers has empowered a new generation of them. Taken as a whole, the trillion-dollar war machine is a sustained, evidence-rich argument that the American military enterprise has become something its founders never intended. A self-sustaining system that consumes the nation's wealth, distorts its institutions, and shapes its very imagination, all while delivering less real security than ever. The book's lasting value is its insistence that this is not natural law, but human arrangement, built by particular choices and capable of being unbuilt. A people made for more than endless war need not accept it as their permanent condition. The genuine question the book leaves the reader with is whether a society so thoroughly shaped to love the machine can still find the will to choose peace, and whether the talents now poured into weapons might be turned at last toward the things that heal rather than destroy. This has been a summary of The Trillion-Dollar War Machine by William D. Hartung and Ben Freeman. It is a clear-eyed, deeply reported, and genuinely important book, and this summary is no substitute for the full weight of its evidence and argument. Read it in full. It will change how you see nearly every flyover at a ball game and every war film at the theater.